Okay, welcome. Item 1, membership and membership update. Again, in terms of some changes since the last meeting, James Wilson has subsequently been in touch and unfortunately felt the need to stand down from Schools Forum, so we've reluctantly accepted James's resignation. But I'm also delighted that members may recall that historically the previous head at James Calvert Spence College, Neil Rogers, was involved in the Schools Forum. Having appointed a new head, I'm delighted that James Andriott has expressed an interest to join Schools Forum and is able to attend this morning. Welcome, James.
Thank you. Looking forward to this. Thanks very much.
Yeah, welcome, James. Great to have you on board.
So the only other item in terms of membership and membership update, we do have a vacancy currently for an early years representative. I am pleased to report, though, there has been some interest in that, and the sort of early years sector are currently organising a mechanism by which a representative can be appointed. It will be a competitive process. There has been more than one expression of interest, but I would be hopeful that we'd have somebody in place for the next meeting in February.
Thanks, Bruce. Okay, so we move on to item 2, which is apologies for absence. Understandably, we have 1 or 2 this morning.
Yeah, we've had apologies from Dave Cookson, Abigail Russell, Sarah Smith, Joanne Holmes, Nicola Greffel, Richard Carr, and Barry Reid.
Thanks, Luke. Item 3, which is disclosures of interest, if any, just a reminder that either to disclose interest at the start of the meeting or in relation to any particular item. Agenda item 4, which is the minutes and matters arising, which are on page 3 to 12 of your agenda pack. Bruce and I have been through them and can't identify anything that we think is an issue, but if anyone spotted anything, can you please raise this now? Okay, so can we, sorry, Mike Dean Hall.
Just an extra clarification on the first page, I'm down as head teacher Wooler in Glendale Middle School. It's Wooler First and Glendale Middle, just a minor thing.
Okay, thanks. Luke, can we correct that on the record, please?
Yeah, no problem.
Chair, true record with the alterations.
Thanks, Graham. Okay, item 5, communications. Quite a long paper. I hope people have had a chance to read through it. We have potentially, well, Bruce and I have discussed this in a pre-meeting, and we have potentially, well, we've got a suggestion to perhaps go through this document in a little bit more detail outside of this meeting. Bruce, do you want to take us through?
Yes, obviously happy to take any initial observations or points for discussion that members may have. But we do have a high needs committee meeting in the diary for early February. It struck me that it might be more appropriate for it to be the major point of discussion at that meeting, at which point we would also hope to get the recently appointed head of SEN involved, Jessica Conway. Again, hopefully, the schedule of meetings circulated, it currently states the High Needs Committee to be on the 3rd of May, but unfortunately that's a Monday, sorry, the 3rd of February. That's a Monday, that's my error. We propose that we'd hold a High Needs Committee 2 weeks from today and take this item as the major point of discussion at that point.
All right.
If members are in agreement with that.
So what date is that then now, Bruce? Please?
It would be 2 weeks today, Graham, so it would be Wednesday the 5th of February.
5th of February, right, that's okay, that's no problem as long as I know. The only comment I would like to make on this is obviously the on page 40 onwards, it's got obviously all the local authorities, and obviously Northumberland is there with about 41% of educational care plans done within the 20 weeks. I'm quite shocked when I looked at other authorities within the North East, like Durham and Newcastle, with very, very little of theirs done. So I think we're quite pleased that ours is, I would say, in the middle ranking, but I think we could do with improvements on it.
David, you've got your hand up. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, Graham, that's for 22, 23, or is it 23, 24? It's a year out of date, Graham. So this year's figures will be around the 60% mark.
Well, that's good to hear then, David. Thank you. Yeah.
And the current average completion rate, so anybody that's in the system at the moment going through EHCP application, the average is 21.7 weeks. So if everyone was 21.7 weeks, this is a statistical thing, isn't it? Then we'd have a completion rate of 0. But if every plan was completed in 21.7 weeks, most parents will be happy with that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's close to the 20 weeks.
Yeah.
There is a way to get our percentages increased by ignoring some that are already in the system, and morally we're never going to do that. So everyone's in their place. We're working them through. The completion rate was at 24.8 weeks. It's now down to 21.7 weeks, and our completion rate overall has improved to about 60% at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Through the chair, do you think when we have this meeting on the 5th for the High Needs Committee, as chair of the High Need, do you think you can come up with a little paper giving a real update where we are, David, please?
Yeah, more than pleased to do that. That'll be really helpful for us, actually, because we really value scrutiny in this particular area. It's something we've been working on very hard, and we're making some progress. And so we welcome the scrutiny.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Bruce?
It would obviously, just further to David's point, I think it was worth saying as well, it probably illustrates the danger of sort of looking at one statistic in relation to EHCPs in isolation. We know in terms of the context of Northumberland that numbers have gone up by in excess of 20% over the last 2 and 3 years. And obviously the figure to the left of that column indicates that, it's 6.5% now in terms of, of children and young people have education, health and care plans. So we're hitting those targets despite higher numbers. And it's, again, about looking at it in the overall context, I think.
Thanks, Bruce. Okay, so if everyone's happy to basically make that the key focus of the next High Needs Committee meeting on Wednesday the 5th, do that. And just a reminder that all members of Schools Forum are welcome to attend the High Needs Committee meeting. There's no bar on membership. The more the merrier, Graham.
Yeah, I think so, yeah, because it all affects every school right across the county. So, yes, it's not
Great.
Sorry if I may, Chair, as well, a very final comment on this item. I apologise, but I know the copy of the report I circulated had a really irritating press embargo watermark right the way through it. I have managed to track down, subsequent to the 15th, a new one, and I will circulate that to all members. Great,
thanks, Bruce.
All right.
Okay, if we can move on to what I believe will be the substantive item of this morning's business, which is item 6, because there are some decisions to be made, and regrettably there are some. Well, the level of our challenges increased because of the way that funding's been distributed nationally to each local authority. So that's set in the dedicated schools grant. So again, Bruce, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Obviously, in terms of the report, I hope everybody's got sight. I'm happy to share it on screen if that provides a benefit to anybody, but I'll assume that people are able to see a copy. Before we get into the detail of the report, obviously, I'll just remind people of the respective recommendations we need to consider at the meeting. There are 2 specifics, having discussed this in some detail at the previous meeting. There are 2 specifics we need to consider. It's specifically a new request in relation to the use of the growth fund for 2 bulge classes at KEVI, which is covered in the recommendation 2.2. And then there's de-delegation decisions for all of our maintained schools, covered in the recommendation 2.3. All of the figures have been held in relation to the funding values as per last year. But again, we'll pick those up in the major part of the report. Again, there's we've taken some sense of pride in the past in the fact that we have managed to move relatively seamlessly towards national funding formula. and indeed sort of paid national funding formula values for the current financial year 2024-25. Just a reminder at the bottom in paragraph 3 in terms of the ESFA's definition around that. Again, you mirror national funding formula if you're within 2.5% of formula factors. That obviously 2.5% can be crucial, but that's the working definition the ESFA use in terms of that. Again, we discussed the respective transfer to the high needs block, and we'll pick up that specific decision taken under delegated powers subsequently. Obviously, when we met in late November, we didn't at that point have the detail of the DSG, the dedicated schools grant, for any of the 4 blocks, but particularly in relation to the schools block. One of the things I've emphasised on the first page is it's important that we're not simply comparing last year's DSG to this year's DSG, whether it's at local authority level for Northumberland or at individual school level, because there have been changes this year. And the key one is essentially the rolling in of some of the grants that are being paid separately for this year. And that's essentially what the table outlines there. The figures above the table showing an adjusted total, whereas the initial DSG allocation was 229.7 million, and on the face of it, a new allocation of 244.9 may look a significant increase. After the grants that are being paid separately this year but are being rolled in for next year are taken into consideration, the figure, essentially the equivalent figure for the current year, is 242.9 million compared to 244.9 million, an increase of just over £2 million, which is 0.83%, which is a more accurate representation across the schools block. Across the total DSG allocation overall, obviously the increase is £18 million overall, or 5.65%, but by far the single biggest influence in that is the extension of the early years responsibilities, which I know we outline elsewhere, further on later in the report. It's worth reminding as well that, again, the dedicated schools grant is subject to legislation. I know in terms of we're preparing a statement at the moment, which is required from Section 151 officers, that the grant is used in its entirety in line with the grant conditions, and that's being sort of tidied up for the previous year now. Key thing to highlight really is and the most significant issue facing Northumberland is in relation to pupil numbers, and that's been a significant driver in terms of figures for this year. Whereas last year we reported a fall in of numbers 253 across both primary and secondary, we're showing a further fall this year of 607 pupils, split between primary and secondary, as outlined in the table at the bottom of page 52. I suppose the major the majority of those pupils are being lost at primary level, and that's obviously has ramifications in terms of for the future funding that we're going to receive in Northumberland. And again, just the very simple financial context of this, the minimum per pupil funding levels that are an integral part of the the national funding formula. If we take those as outlined in the paragraph at the top of page 53, of being 4,955 for primary students and 6,465 for secondary students, there's a minimum of, in terms of lost funding, of 3.3 million there in terms of Northumberland schools, and that's just using the minimum per pupil funding. So the actual figure would be a more sophisticated one than that. What's causing the fall in numbers? There are two key factors. Essentially the fall in the birth rate, and again, this is where it fits in with other initiatives across the county at the moment. Very simplistically, if we see the year 11 students leaving, and again, this is about the APT and the funding allocation for the schools block is specifically around sort of statutory age education. If we look at the year 11 student group leaving, replaced by the reception students coming in, there was a reduction of 460 students between the 3,250 students leaving, in July compared to the 2,790 reception age students starting in September. Another key factor as well, and again, it's figured already in discussions earlier on the agenda, is in terms of, we know that we've got an increasing number of education, health and care plans. Our mainstream schools are meeting the needs of a record number of students within mainstream schools in relation to do that. But we know that the numbers going into special schools have increased as well. And there's a rise there of 134 between the October 23 and October 24 census points. So again, that's essentially that there are other sort of contributory factors around the number of students in terms of being permanently excluded, rise in EOTAS and educated elective home education packages. But that's peripheral compared to the two main influences there in terms of birth rate and special schools. Stops for breath. Any questions, any observations to date? I'll happily plough on. Again, as I've said there, ring fence grants subject to formal grant conditions. Again, requiring sign off by the Section 151 officer. Briefly, we briefed the November meeting in relation to the consultation with schools exercise, which we commenced earlier than usual during the 2024, during the autumn term. At that point, we'd had essentially 17 schools responded to the consultation. The closing date was the subsequent Monday, by which point we had a further 3 schools respond. I think, although we had an additional 3 responses, the key responses and the key messages remained unchanged, really. There was clear support for a 0.5% transfer from the schools block to the high needs block, a reduced majority in favour of a 1% transfer, and no clear consensus around sort of larger transfers for subsequent years. Understandably, there was no clear view about these capping and scaling or which formula factors should be reduced in the event that there was insufficient funding to meet national funding formula values. And again, NFG should be set at the highest level possible so it helps the broadest number of schools. The full results of the questionnaire are attached at an Appendix A, but I don't intend to spend any further time going through that this morning, because we had some good consideration on it at the last meeting in November, unless there are any specific queries. Okay, so in terms of taking the individual DSG blocks one by one, early years block, where we've indicated there's a significant increase in the funding. David, I understand that you were going to do a brief presentation to sort of illustrate some of this. Can I pass to you? Do you want some? If you want some support with the presentation, just please let me know.
Yeah, Bruce, if it's possible that you can do the overview of the block as a whole. The presentation I've got is specific, and I'll chip in absolutely.
Okay,
the presentation I've got is specifically about the calculation of the rates. For the next year.
Yeah, no problem. As we've outlined, the introduction of 15 hours funded childcare for working parents from September 24, increasing to 30 hours from September 25. Clearly, that has been backed by government funding, and that's resulted in the significant increase in the early years block funding we've seen. That obviously presents some challenges for the sector, but working the EY teams working with providers to address that. The proposals for the 25-26 rates sort of based on 3 really key principles. As in previous years, they're trying to passport as much funding to providers as possible by maximising the base rate. The idea was that should support greater transparency overall, support the sustainability and sufficiency of the market, and help all providers who have the challenges in terms of meeting, minimum wage, pension contributions, and NI increases, which are, are going to be a significant challenge for the sector in the forthcoming year. David? Sorry, David, you're on mute.
I said it's a perfect time for me to come in. I thought we were going to talk a little bit more about the overall size of the budget, but as we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the funding rates and an agreement, then I'm happy to dive in.
Okay.
I'll attempt to share my screen. Lost most people.
Yep.
Give me a nod if you can see.
Oh, yes.
So then, as we're aware, I'll do a little bit of background, actually, just to support this, and then whiz through the rationale and the thinking behind the proposed rates. What we're hoping to I think, Bruce, if I'm correct in this, what we're hoping for is a recognition that the methodology used to calculate the rates going forwards is an appropriate one. But also there's plenty of room for flexibility. So if somebody has a particular viewpoint in the way the early years rates are going to be calculated going forwards, then we're obviously happy to take that on board and into consideration. There appears to be, in terms of the overall budget, quite a significant increase. There is quite a significant increase from 30-ish million to 42 million. But the reason for the increase is the fact that the demands within the system are going to be so much greater. So there's extended entitlement, 30 hours entitlement for working parents, and that's going over time, has already progressed to lower age ranges. And we're going to be looking from 9 months old of the learner in the very near future. As a result, almost all the money that it appears to be additional funding into early years is being directly spent on additional provision. For some families, that will be as it's in. I think the policy is intended, which is to encourage people to go back to work while the children are younger. And so that would be a proportion. That proportion is actually an increase in sufficiency requirements for Northumberland and any county in Northumberland. There will also be a number of families for whom they are currently paying for that provision. So the provision already exists, but it's being paid from out of privately out of individual households. Whereas going forwards, currently and going forwards, more of the bill will be paid from the early years block. So I hope that's a reasonable explanation about the size of the growth, and that actually it's already committed to the provision that's across Northumberland. We have something like 374 providers providing funded education, which is what this is in the early sector. I think 108 of those are first and primary schools, and the rest are a mixture of PVI settings and childminders. So it's quite a lot involved in the delivery, and the central team are working exceptionally hard to try to deliver the sufficiency that's required to ensure that any family that's eligible can get the childcare that they need relatively close to their home, or immediately close to their home where humanly possible. We've been pretty successful in that in the past. Our sufficiency planning strategy has been very successful across the early years, but we are in a position where this is quite unprecedented in terms of growth. And so we're a little bit closer to the wire, and there are some highlighted hotspots across Northumberland where we do need to provide additional sufficiency. That sufficiency is driven obviously by the funding rates. If the funding rates are too low, businesses can't operate. If businesses can't operate, they can't offer the provision, and then we get disappointed families. We don't want to be in that position. There is also some quite significant pressure across the system. There's a few multiple whammies for early years providers and other educational providers actually, but particularly so in early years. So the increases in minimum wage, the increase in pension contribution, national insurance increases are all falling across those schools and private enterprises which are providing this provision. And also the fact that some of the growth is allocated, for example, to babies and 2-year-olds. Actually, those babies and 2-year-olds, we clearly operate on a smaller ratio, and therefore that's though it might be a smaller increase in numbers, it's a large increase in relatively in staffing in order to accommodate that, and therefore increased numbers of a younger age means more staffing and therefore an additional hit for minimum wage, pension contributions, national insurance. So it's clearly quite a complex picture. The funding rates have always been pretty complex, and we also get the figures quite late in the year. So each year I probably apologise at this point. Those of you that heard this a few times will probably be getting quite expert in the funding rates for early years. But for others, some of this might be new, but please don't hesitate in asking questions. So in terms of the changes for 25-26 and setting those funding rates, we're proposing the following criterion. The one that I've mentioned the most about passporting as much funding as possible into the base rate to support the universal provision, which is growing. The second one is maintaining deprivation supplements. So we've actually been historically quite on the front foot in terms of providing deprivation supplements in and around the hourly rates. One of the slides I'll show you later might look like we're not increasing some where we have increased it in the past. But for this particular model, what you'll see is that the government allocation for deprivation, the pupil premium, early years pupil premium, has been increased significantly by central government. So we're sort of taking that opportunity to build on our base structure of having funding rates for deprivation relatively high in the past. We're balancing that off against maybe looking to try and have an increased in the base rate for all, which will include deprived learners, of course. And you'll see that on a slide coming up shortly. And there's also historically there was our Send Inclusion Fund included quite a significant, 100% contribution actually from the higher needs block, due to the factors in and around the higher needs block we're all well aware of over the last two years or so. The early years block has last year took on the funding for the early years inclusion fund to come from the block, and that's continuing in this proposal. Just a bit more detail, so you can see where we are and the proposals on the change. The first bit's about the top slice. In 24-25, there's allowable to be a 5% top slice to fund central services to support early years. So that's business support as well as educational quality and sufficiency support. Even though the range has been 5% this year just gone, or that we're in, we historically have only taken a proportion of that, 2.7% last year. For 25-26, we're looking at a 2% retainment, so hopefully that'll demonstrate a more efficient use of the resource against the 4% allowable, but we're trying to maximise the money going to providers, not being top sliced. Second point on here is relevance to deprivation, and it looks like we're going to have a slight decrease in that, and that's possibly something for discussion, but actually it's more than balanced against the early years pupil premium increases which are coming from central government. And the inclusion fund last year, the inclusion fund used about 0.5% of the total budget. As the budget's growing, there's some growth in planned inclusion fund, but the overall proportion being used for that will reduce, hence sticking to the proposals, the principles of the proposals. Top line figures, just to demonstrate the percentages that I've just talked about, maintaining the core costs, maintaining the overall deprivation payment, and a slight decrease in the early years inclusion fund as a proportion. Now to the nitty-gritty. I mean, this is always a very complex slide each year. There are a number of funding rates, different ages and different needs. We've got the percentage increase from the DFE rates, and then the proposed increase from an NCC perspective, engaging with the principals I've discussed. You'll see that shows a greater increase for 3 and 4 year olds than is proposed by DFE. Sorry, it's split into two figures because we actually gained some additional funding mid-year this year and adjusted rates in September as well as April. The 2 year olds, again, an increase proposed universally for above that of the increase in the DFE. Under 2 year olds, same again. Early years pupil premium, that's a central government funded increase of 47%, and we're planning on passing that on. We've always completely passed on early years pupil premium contributions. Our own deprivation score and our, if you like, voluntary contribution to deprivation, we're proposing stays where it is, reflective of the higher increase from the central government proportion to that. Giving us overall our early years pupil premium, early years pupil premium plus contribution has gone up 22%. So deprivation payments up overall by 22%. And Disability Access Fund, which is passported 100% onto providers. Just as a side point, we don't always get all of our DAF claimed. We have extensive programs to try to ensure that every learner that's applicable does receive their DAF funding. But actually any DAF funding which is left at the end is reinvested into early years SEND provision. And so that's a little bit of flexibility that might come later on in the year. I'll do the last slide and then take any questions. So we're maximising provision to all providers, passporting as much as possible, and where possible, our percentage rates have increased against the rates the DFE have increased centrally. Any questions on quite a complex topic? Bruce, in terms of our proposals for later in the paper, it's around agreeing that those proposed 25-26 rates, is it not?
Technically, the schools forum aren't required to agree those, but obviously we're consulting on them. I think the reason we historically brought them to the February meeting, but we've started to try to bring them to the January meeting, really to maximise the amount of notice we can give to providers so they can, sort of deliver their financial plans for April and beyond. So again, in terms of, as stated in the report, we're essentially asking schools forum to, note the recommendations as per the rates and the rationale behind them, as you've just outlined, David.
Okay. I think in previous years, and there was a temptation this year that we were going to offer maybe 2 or 3 different models for consideration, with different values in each table. But the complexity of it just was, I think, was too much for consideration. So I suppose really I would welcome any viewpoints on folk where increasing all the rates at a higher rate than the DFE have proposed. We are continuing to extend our deprivation element, but the main focus of this has been on those universal base rates. And if folk are happy with that as a balanced way forwards, then yeah, happy to take comments or now or at a later date, actually.
Graham.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Thanks for that, David. As you said, there's a lot of detail here. In order for us to have a view, I think it's just understanding what possible trade-offs have been. So there's a lot of kind of positives here, I think, in terms of figures going up, increases. I'm not particularly clear where maybe the challenges have been in terms of difficult decisions. You touched on the second slide that some of the percentage retentions are lower than previous years. So maybe that's where the difficult decisions have come. So I think appreciate the fact you've just gone for one proposal rather than too many to increase the complexity, but it'd be useful just to understand what the challenges were in terms of arriving at these decisions, and then we might be able to offer a view as to whether we support the conclusions that were arrived at.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that, Graham. I think certainly there are local authorities in the country who are looking at an increase in funding and an increase in numbers of learners apparently on the books, and therefore have increased their central teams correspondingly, and therefore maintained their percentage. One or a set of the difficult decisions was saying things like some, not all, but some of this provision is already in existence, but it's paid for by parents, and the central teams already support that provision extensively. So the increase in the funding coming through our financial systems doesn't mean that that's a percentage increase in the delivery. It's already existing. So our decision was that we would maintain the current size of the early years team in order to enable more of the increase to be passed on directly to providers. So that was a tricky or a challenge, if you like, which other local authorities have taken a different route on. And the other payoff is it's not. There could be an argument, particularly in terms of all of our priorities, both from a school setting right through to council priorities around inequalities, and therefore we have traditionally had quite maybe a higher than other local authorities proportion allocated to deprivation, to both to our allocation of pupil premium plus more than central government would. And the other difficult decision, I suppose, or in designing the proposal, was to maintain our additional deprivation score and only own and accept, obviously, the central government deprivation increase, rather than increasing it in a parallel way ourselves. And there may be some settings that would believe that actually, on the ground, for some areas, it's got tougher than ever, and there are additional costs related to that, and therefore that deprivation supplement it's gone up 22% in this proposal, but they might still say, actually, no, that's not enough. So that was another set of challenging discussions in terms of trying to formulate this model.
Thanks, David. That was helpful. And my view, I guess, from a schools forum perspective, is that we'll be guided by officers as to the decision around central services, the early years team, and if the view is that that's sufficient to meet need, then that that's the guidance that we're getting. I suppose a point to make in relation to the inequalities and the additional NCC going beyond with regards to deprivation is just that we're not disadvantaging those that maybe have lower deprivation kind of requirements, if you like, but they've still got a business to run. They've still got provision to put in place, and we're not taking money away from where it's also needed, just by being kind of it's admirable to be putting more into deprivation, but we've got to make sure that the consequence of that isn't counterproductive elsewhere.
I think that exact viewpoint is the highest priority in this proposal. We're saying that all settings are having challenges around ratios, national insurance contributions, minimum wage increases, and therefore this year the main focus is the universal rate, because that hits everybody full stop regardless of where you are, there could have been a trickier if central government had decided not to increase their pupil premium rate, then we might still be coming with a zero increase proposal for those reasons from our pupil premium plus rate, but we've managed to balance one against another in this proposal, and therefore, generally speaking, I'm just talking, and I'm sure this will be echoed if we had our representative with us, but generally speaking, the majority of private, voluntary, and independent sector lean towards an increase or the highest possible base rate, as opposed to additionality from deprivation. That's their gut feeling. They'd rather get the rate the same across the board for everybody. Is the main anecdotal driver from them.
Okay, thank you. How are you?
Okay, that's it from me, Bruce, if that's okay.
Thanks, David. Again, if we're happy to move on in terms through the report, section 6, again, outline of the overall high needs block allocation. We see a 7.9% increase on the previous on the current year's 24-25 figure. Again, I suppose by comparison with the schools block, that increase may look is certainly larger than that, but that's, again, as we set out previously, we put that in the context of other high needs indicators and activity we're aware of, such as, you know, the increases in terms of in excess of 20% year on the number of plans. As in previous years, again, I make reference in terms of first paragraph. If you want your DSG on a page, that's essentially reflected in the the Annex 1 breakdown, which provides a good overall summary showing how we have deductions at source in relation to some of the external provision. As in previous years, we're bringing the overall grant allocation to the notice of forum at this point, and we'll produce a more detailed high needs budget, which will clearly be a challenging one, for the February meeting. And again, we outline that in the two sort of notes in bold at the bottom, essentially, including the recommendation to bring the high needs budget back to February if everybody's happy with that. That's it. There's no objections.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Again, more information in relation to the schools block.
Sorry, Bruce. We're getting there.
David, yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to dive in with the obvious. I mean, obviously, there's a welcome in that increase in the high needs block, and obviously in the tables higher up, looking at 7.8% and stuff like this. A lot of that may on paper look like a really good deal, but again, just against you mentioned the increase in the number of EHC plans, but also the outturn from this year is still probably looking at a 6.5, 6.9 million overspend on this year's allocation. So that increase is already allocated. On the ground, it's unlikely to look like the overall increase in the high needs block will lead to a direct increase in provision. There are obvious, as we always do on a daily basis, we're all working on efficiencies and economies of scale and all those sorts of things. But it's the highlight of the increase is obviously positive, but balanced against the fact that our combined system has already spent that and will grow again next year.
Yeah, agreed. And again, I think towards the next within the next couple of meetings, I'm sure we'll have a financial update from Callum and corporate finance colleagues, which will underline that. Okay, moving on in terms of the schools block allocation, I'll see the reports there. I'm going to go through some of the figures in more detail and hopefully illustrate, why we've received the settlement we've received. Again, just a reminder that in terms of obviously lost within the deal of the paper, while at the November meeting, after some searching discussion, we agreed that and a two-phase recommendation to the first phase of 0.5% transfer from the schools block to the high needs block, and agreed by a majority decision subsequently that up to a further 0.5% so up to 1% in total could be transferred. You know, having received the final settlement figure, we've taken the decision simply to cap the transfer at 0.5%, and that's been represented in the, you know, both the figures for both the high needs block and the schools block, as reflected in Annex 1 and in the individual funding formula values proposed for Northumberland in the table further on in this paragraph. If I can just share a presentation with you, if you'll indulge me, please. Just try to outline some of the, excuse me, share my screen first. Outline some of the key influences. First of all, as we've sort of outlined previously, you know, the rolling in of the grants for 25-26, you know, again, we've outlined that in the nature of the report, but it's important we emphasise that because it does have a significant impact on what the real overall increase is, as we've outlined, 0.83%. Again, how those figures are arrived at, you may have. My report has historically in the past always made reference to the primary units of funding, the PUFs, the PUFs, and the secondary units of funding, the SUFs. They're the key element used by the ESFA in calculating the DSG allocations for you know, for all local authorities. But it was evident in terms of the importance of the impact of that when we got the numbers through this year. It's important to outline, if you talk about primary units of funding, it's not just about those elements we would traditionally align with the students, such as the OPUs, such as free school meals and free school meals for Ever Six, such as low prior attainment. It also carries, because in terms of the primary school, elements of the lump sum funding, sparsity, and also, if applicable, minimum funding guarantee and the minimum per pupil funding elements. The premises by and that happens across both primary and secondary. Premises by comparison is a relatively small element of the funding, and the vast majority of that 3.4 million is essentially the NNDR, which is, you know, in and out in respect of schools. There's then the other element, which is essentially the local authority-led element, which is the terms of an element for growth and falling rules funding. We're obviously using a small proportion of that as part of the report today. So what that meant, it was important to show the difference between the provisional settlement and then the you know, the final settlement. The provisional calculation, and again, as we've outlined, I've only worked through the calculations here in relation to the primary unit of funding figures, but the same principle would apply for the secondary unit of funding, just we didn't lose quite as many pupils, so quite as much funding in respect of that. The important thing to highlight is that the actual financial value stays the same. That's calculated by the ESFA earlier on in the year, and then by reference to the previous year's pupils. So essentially, when we had initial indicative allocations or provisional allocations out, the total primary core funding would have been 128.2 million. When the actual pupil figures from the October census are made available, it doesn't involve any adjustment to the financial unit per pupil, but because we've lost those students at primary, as you can see, we've received rather than 128 million, 125 million, and seen a reduction across the sort of primary element of 2.8 million. Yeah. Again, what that means in practice is, in terms of, you know, we've talked about 607 loss of 607 pupils overall. You know, approximately, we talked about based on minimum per pupil values of 3.3 million. In practice, after, you know, those students who, you know, that would be working at a higher level than simply minimum per pupil funding, when you factor in issues such as free school meals, low prior attainment, and the such like, you know, we estimate essentially there was a 3.7 million loss between the provisional figures and the actual figures received in December. We did sort of query and raise the sort of mechanisms and the calculation of the units of funding through the ESFA. And essentially, I'm not taking a response out of context. The response was highlighted: if your pupil numbers decrease, then your funding will decrease proportionally. The effect of the school-led funding elements is that an increase in the average number of pupils per school, and then essentially increasing the number of lump sums you need to pay out per pupil, because that will come down as well, will lead to pressure on your local formula, which we're acutely aware of. Whereas increasing the average number of people will leave you with additional funding. I don't think anybody's debating that, but it's about obviously the impact of that for this year. The national funding formula will then catch up to these changes the following year. This is an inevitable effect of the lag funding system. Ironically, the one element where we did retain, sorry, I should finish this. The one element where we did sort of retain numbers was essentially around free school meals, which showed a modest increase year on year. Due in some part, there was a campaign run over the summer to maximise the uptake of free school meals ahead of the October census. That will bear fruit. That will bear fruit in subsequent, funding formula settlements. But essentially, because of the way the primary and secondary units of funding are set prior to the summer and prior to the October census, we didn't receive a benefit of that this year. Stop sharing my screen. Back to the report. That was slightly technical. I'm stopping quite happy to take any questions which I'll willing to respond on. Or otherwise, I'll simply continue on the report. Hi, Graham.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bruce. I'm not sure what you just went through there answered the question that I had, but in the paper, you pointed to the fact that the NFF would cost, I think there's a figure, it's 245 million. So if we were to replicate the formula values, it would cost 245 million point 292, I think.
Yeah.
But our schools block's only got 244,936 in it. So it falls short of what replicating the NFF precisely would be. So I suppose my question is, did the explanation that you just gave account for that? Or and if it did account for it, when we move to a hard formula, are we always going to find, given our circumstances with falling rolls and all of that you've explained earlier, and the lag effect, are we always going to find that we're not going to be able to implement the formula in full for the reasons given?
If there is, and again, in terms of pupil projections, may indicate if there is an ongoing decline in the overall student numbers, we're going to struggle to meet national funding formula, Graham. Yeah, I can't.
And is that a fundamental flaw in the formula that the F40 group needs to take forward? Because that seems to me that we are, up until this point in Schools Forum over the last several years, we've been happily sailing towards alignment with the formula values, and never really, well, I've certainly not been clear that there's a risk because of our circumstances that actually we won't be able to implement it, which seems that we're being disadvantaged as a consequence of that.
Essentially, the key technical aspect to it is the use of the previous census numbers to calculate the unit of funding, and then it's multiplied by the new census numbers. We don't use, because the ESFA want to publish those units of funding in advance. Historically they haven't awaited the latest census information. It's a point I have I have considered taking F40, and there is a sort of meeting planned next month, and I'm going to see if that's a key issue for me. I can't believe it's not a key issue for other members as well. Obviously there is a key focus around SEN at the moment, but we don't want to lose sight of the wider schools block and schools funding issues. So it's essentially, in a nutshell, it's down to the delayed pupil numbers in calculating the, the funding unit elements.
And whilst there's still some flexibility for schools, forum, local authorities to adjust the formula values to suit, my understanding was that when the hard formula came in, that flexibility wouldn't be there. So what would we do in such a circumstance if the aggregate formula provision was, or what it should have been is that our schools block is lower than that? How, what would we do in that circumstance?
I think in terms of, the move to that's why, again, these are the points we made to the SFA. We can't believe it was ever their intention that we would have to move away from the national funding formula values. But we've highlighted the impact of these falling schools roll that's precipitated that. The SFA's line was, again, in terms of your mirroring, they publish a range of permissible funding formula factors for each and every authority, which essentially we remain within. So they haven't raised that as a problem. I think the move to a hard formula, a hard funding formula with uniform rates across the country, calculated, dare I say, simply by multiplying a number of pupils by a uniform factor value is probably some way off, and probably still, and potentially not affordable on that basis.
See, David's coming in. I've got just some further queries that might be more appropriate to wait until you get to the point in the paper, just in relation to table 1 and some of the decisions around the local formulas, formulae, and then just some queries around capping, ceiling, and the MFG proposals for this year.
Okay.
Thank you.
David?
I think, Graham, you might hit the nail on the head as to why the fixed national funding formula is not implemented nationally across the board. If that is the case, and it's been mooted, we've been working towards it because I think we were told maybe 3 or 4 years ago that the national funding formula was going to be fixed, and that was it. But one of the reasons maybe hasn't been, if that was the case and it was fixed, the allocation would have to be matched to those funding levels. And at the minute, the allocation is not matched to that; it's matched to last year's. Hence the problem.
Okay, so we'll continue through the report. I'm sort of page 58 now. Dealing with, again, we touch on MFG at the bottom of page 57, top of page 58. Essentially, we'll pick those up when we look at the funding table. The general principle we've applied previously is that we've used the maximum value possible in terms of MFG. The differences made by the MFG value is very marginal in terms of tens of thousands of pounds as opposed to hundreds or millions. And so essentially, it wasn't an option simply to meet national funding formula values and make a small MFG adjustment to introduce that. It simply wasn't feasible this year. Just an update on the disapplication requests. At the time of writing this report last week, we'd reported that we'd submitted the disapplication request to the SFA in respect of the reorganisations at Coquet and Berwick and the exceptional rent costs. Again, at the time of writing the report, we hadn't received any confirmation from the SFA in relation to those, but I'm pleased to report that yesterday we received an email confirming that they'd accepted those exceptional adjustments in respect of those, so we can implement them, as we've outlined and as we've applied previously. Again, there is a specific recommendation in relation to this, but as part of school place planning for September 2025, it's been identified that we require for students within catchment 2 additional year 7 bulge classes in Morpeth at Kevy. Growth policy has previously been ratified by Schools Forum, outlining that, you know, sort of growth funding driven by sort of in-catchment area demand will be funded at ORPU and ORPU only. So, you know, again, when we outlined the elements of the funding formula, we had a growth element of in excess of £900,000 in there. We've applied the majority of that to support the transfer to that from the schools block to the High East block, but we do require 187,000 to fund those classes in line with the growth policy, and obviously we'll take a formal recommendation on that subsequently. Again, outlined the, you know, again, the final formula values have been set under delegated powers, taking into consideration views expressed at schools forum in the November meeting and the previous direction of travel. And again, if we have a look at the, you know, again, the proposal would be to submit values on the basis of the figures in table 1. And Graham, I know you've alluded to that, so I'll, you know, again, look at that now on page 60. The guidance from the ESFA itself even concedes in some cases where they've applied the a relatively low margin of 1% in some cases, formula increases to, and then rounded, that has resulted even within the national funding formula to no increase in the bandings, which can be seen in elements such as the, you know, some of the EDACI deprivation bands this year. For the reasons we've outlined previously, obviously we were faced with some difficult decisions and difficult choices. Picking up the point you were making about capping and scaling and the use of MFG, Graham, they have been useful tools we've applied in the past when needing to shave sort of tens of thousands of pounds off the overall allocation and distribution in order to fund national funding formula. Capping and scaling, as members will recall, is essentially where any increase in excess of a certain threshold, and we've used sort of, again, we used 2.13% last year. We'd used a higher threshold, I think, of 4% the year before. Any increase over and above that can be scaled back by a proportion in order to fund the overall sort of funding formula proposals. Because of the impact of the loss of 600 students and the consequential drop in the grant funding, that wasn't an option for us, essentially. So we've essentially proposed the formula values as outlined in column E in table 1. We've applied broadly the same levels of increase to the ORPU factors, and essentially, if nothing else, to make things easier to communicate and deal in, we've rounded to the nearest sort of, you know, nearest unit, nearest tens of pounds in that instance, and that's an approach we've taken across the board. Although it would have been permissible, as set by the, you know, the table of permissible values set for us by the SFA, to reduce some of the formula values, we've sought to avoid that in all cases. But again, what that's meant in practice is, you know, relatively low levels of increase, as can be seen, you know, through the table, because we've had a relatively low level of overall settlement. So again, the proposal is that formula values for Northumberland will be set in line with the figures in column E, with no capping and scaling being applied, which again should make it easier for schools in terms of part of the calculation of the budgets, and a minimum funding guarantee of 0%, which is the maximum we can set it at, which essentially means that no school should suffer a per pupil fall in funding for next year, you know, in line with the mechanics behind that. Okay, Graham, does that help, or did you have any specific queries to pick up in relation to the funding formula values per se?
Yeah, yes to both. Yes, it helps, and yes, so got a query. I suppose the one that jumped out was ORPU not being in line with the NFF value. I'm just concerned that that's kind of fundamental core funding for schools. But I'm guessing you'll say that if that were to be aligned, there would have to be a trade-off elsewhere to recognise the shortfall in relation to how the schools block compares with the what we ordinarily would have got under NFF. So just to query that, and with regards to the MFG, is that in relation to more broadly than OPU, but at key stage 2, 3, 4, there's a certain minimum per pupil encompassing all the different contributing elements of funding, and all schools in Northumberland will at least hit that minimum threshold. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I'll pick that one up. I mean, and again, just providing a little bit of context of the, the £240 million grant allocation, the OPU allocation accounts for, approximately 173, by far the largest sort of single element of it. So if we were to, essentially we would have had to cut formula values elsewhere. If we were to try to, and essentially I think it would have been unaffordable, Graham. To match national funding formula. The point you make in relation to MFG and minimum per pupil funding factors, I think the minimum per pupil funding factor is the key one here. Again, minimum per pupil funding is set by the ESFA at the level outlined in the report previously at 4,900 and change for primary and 6,495, I think I might have said, for secondary earlier in the report. That was something introduced in terms of by previous governments to give a, as it says in the tin, a basic minimum per pupil element. It protects schools in, shall we say, in less deprived areas to provide it essentially provides a bottom line, a protection, a funding floor, if essentially for those. And under the sort of direction of the ESFA, we're obliged to meet that. If we weren't, we have to pay minimum pupil funding values. If we weren't, that would require a disapplication request, which essentially is inferred. It wouldn't be supported unless there was an exceptional case, and we felt we didn't have that. That will cause some of the variations in funding you will see when you look at the appendix I circulated yesterday, where in terms of some schools, generally speaking, there's a straight line relationship between pupil numbers and increases in funding for the following financial year. That's not always the case because of the influence of the minimum per pupil funding, which is protected and protects schools, who receive less deprivation funding through the other formula funding factors such as free school meals Forever 6 and EDACI.
Yeah, that's clear. Just a final point, if I've completely understood this, there was the option to go to transfer an additional 0.5% from schools brought to high needs, but that option has not been pursued and it's settled at the initial 0.5. So if that's the case, I just want to say, I appreciate that, because I had real reservations about that second tranche going because of the impact it would have had on individual schools' budgets. And I know you've made the point, well, it's all schools' money and it gets, fed back into the system. But actually, in terms of, running schools, it's really important that we've got, as much that we can control within our own jurisdiction. So that was a really good call in my view. So thank you for that. Graham, I mean, you remember you had the debate at the last November meeting, and we're conscious of the fact that was a blind discussion before we'd seen the any funding allocations, and that's why the provision to give delegated powers is such an important one. Obviously, the 0.5% transfer equates to approximately £1.2 million. You've looked what that meant, in terms of the overall settlement. If we'd taken a further £1.2 million, well, the impact would have been evident. It would have been cut across the board and caused, real problems. We know that both sectors, schools and high needs, are facing competing pressures, but essentially it's all part of the same thing. So that's what's informed the decision simply to pursue the 0.5% transfer. Yeah. Okay. Right.
Any other questions in relation to the schools block and how we've got there? Okay, I'll move on. Following the schools block, section 8 of the report, key issue for obviously maintained school members of the schools forum. Historically, there's been a system of de-delegation in place to pay for key services such as the contingency fund for restructuring school reorganisation, free school meals eligibility, trade union facility time, and English as an additional language service. We have, to support our maintained schools, held those rates for some years at the same level, as outlined in the final table of the report, and are proposing to do so again for 2025-26. Again, we'll take a formal vote on that one at the conclusion of the report. That's not to say, of course, that other schools can't access services, but it's, again, we're about to launch the schools SLA portal, through which both academies and our special schools can and do choose to buy into a multitude of services, both the ones outlined there in terms of funded through delegation for maintained schools, and a wider sort of, a wider choice of council services, from both sort of central corporate departments and sort of education place and others. Again, unless there are any other questions in relation to de-delegation, we'll move on. Sort of section 9 central services block. Again, I've seen a modest increase in this year, but some of that reflects essentially the rolled in grant element we've outlined in more detail in the schools block. Again, as we've done in the past, we'll bring a more detailed budget back to the February meeting in respect of that, reflecting both the ongoing and the historic commitments. Okay, as I alluded to before, the next page represents the very good, the plan on the grant on a page, if you like, Annex 1. That's a good overall summary showing both the makeup of the early years elements, how the high needs block works, and the place funding deductions are made from that, and tracing the transfer and delegation from the schools block. I'll not linger on that anymore, but essentially it just provides a good synopsis of what we've been discussing this morning. Appendix A is essentially the full results of the school consultation outlined earlier, and Appendix B stroke C, and apologies, the marker in the report was for Appendix C, which I'd circulated, but I'd refer to it as Appendix B in the report. I did circulate that paper yesterday, again, to provide the indicative allocations, and these are again all subject to final ESFA agreement of the DSG allocations for 24-25. As I said previously, generally speaking, funding is in line with pupil numbers. Falling pupil numbers will, particularly when margins are so tight, result in a fall in overall DSG funding. And an increase will generally see an increase in overall funding. There are some caveats to that, as I outlined previously in discussions with Graham around the impact of the minimum per pupil funding. But those figures are provided for information at Appendix BC. What we're seeing in terms of the overall pupil allocations, to the schools is an increase of £1.7 million on the previous year. What I have done in the appendix is roll in the specific grant figures, not just at a total local authority level, but at a school level, which I'm sure some of your high caliber finance staff will have done by now anyway. Okay, I'm going to pause and then go back to the recommendations of the report, if I may. Are there any other questions or queries in relation to the to this report, to item 6?
Sorry to be a pain, but
no.
Just so I understand the recommendation in relation to Kevin, which seems an obvious one, which is there's a growth fund, and therefore that seems a sensible thing. That's the recommendation. you know, why is it just a formality that it comes to schools forum, or other kind of knock-on implications that we should be aware of, and therefore it's because otherwise it's going to get nodded through without any debate, which is fine. Supportive of Kevin and that kind of support for the expansion, but there's been no debate about it. Just to understand, is it just an absolute formality, or is it more to it than that?
There's nothing more to it than that. We are required by the regulations to bring notification about any growth fund use to the Notice of Schools Forum for agreement. We have done that in the past. The latest incident was when we used growth fund in a similar fashion for Clarendon Learning Village and for St Bernard Bishops, facing specific challenges in those partnership areas. So I would like to think it was just simply procedural to reflect some of the the number of challenges we face in specifically in the Morpeth partnership area.
Thank you.
I suppose the question I would have is, has this been transparent and has it been shared with Nash so that all heads know the decisions that have been made? Because obviously it could have implications for other schools, and just to know why particularly it's Morpeth, because obviously if there's an increase in the number of pupils in Morpeth, it's probably impossible to guarantee that all of those extra places will go to pupils in the Morpeth partnership, and it might have implications for the surrounding partnership. And also the fact that that there have been schools and other partnerships have taken on additional classes year in, year out and received no growth funding for that. So it was just about the transparency. So I think Graham's made a good point there. Sue?
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, we wouldn't necessarily share this with Nash, even as a consultative body. Obviously, Schools Forum are the consultative body for this expenditure. But in terms of specifics around Morpeth, it's generated really through the house building in Morpeth. And also supports the change in admissions policy by the Three Rivers, which actually covers, obviously, they're changing in meeting the needs of their catchment area first, whereas their previous admissions policy was about children being educated in their feeder schools, got preferential placement in terms of admissions. So that did obviously have an impact on other partnerships, because once children were moving from their local community into Morpeth in a feeder school, as long as they've been there for 2 years, they got that feeder status, so they never went back to their local community. So so with the change of admissions policy, as well as the housing growth and the use of the Section 106 funding that we're doing currently to build some new capacity at Kevy, this joins it all up as a one-off. We've known it's been coming for a number of years, again because of the house building at St Mary's and in the town centre at Morpeth, and have planned for that. We grew, you might remember, we grew capacity at Chantry Middle School and at Newminster, and again the growth fund was used for that bulge in pupil numbers moving forward, and this funding now follows that through to Kevy as a one-off. We won't expect growth payment next year because the pupils are in the system, and it is a one-off allocation. Unlike when we use the funding in Bedlington for Benabiscup, obviously with changes of planned admission numbers of other academies, that has meant the capacity of Benabiscup actually needed to grow, and that has been a bit of a year-on-year conversation with Benabiscup. So that has been a different picture, Alan, but absolutely take your point. But more than happy to come to Nash and explain to them that particular picture, but they don't actually have any decision-making powers in terms of the allocation. But yeah, more than happy to do that.
Thanks, Sue. I'm not saying they should have any decision-making powers. I just think in the interests of transparency, it would be good for heads to have the bigger picture of things like that across the county, and also selfishly thinking with another hat on, as an ASCO rep, I might get contacted by some other heads saying, why has this been allowed to pass? So I just think that sharing of information rather than finding out after it's been decided by Schools Forum would be good for transparency across the county.
Yeah, I think obviously we were in scrutiny last week, updating a number of our strategies in terms of SEND and AP strategy and looking at the direction of travel for that. So I suggest that we probably talk to Nash and a wider group of school leaders around that, as well as the school organisation plan that ties very much into the conversations we've had here this morning about that fall in birth rate, as well as that demand in special school. So I've suggested, I've said to Bruce, we will put the school organisation plan and the AP and SEND strategy on the agenda for Schools Forum so that you can see the bigger strategy and the picture actually moving forward. So again, just to say, just doing some triangulation of the data earlier on this week, our predictions, you know, are very close to what we experienced. So probably 3 or 4 years ago, we were predicting the reception numbers, you know, for September 2025. Obviously, just looking in detail at one particular partnership this week, but we're only 3 children out from what we predicted 3 years ago. So again, I know we're making these decisions on robust data, and it's just about sharing those, you know, with wider groups so that we can all make that plan for the future, really.
Okay, thanks,
Okay.
Bruce.
Yeah, I was just going to make the point as well. If we were thinking about holding a formula funding committee early in the summer term, it's something we would bring the growth fund policy back to. Just as a refresher, I think the important thing to emphasise in relation to that is, you know, and again, it's not a local not local initiative. It's a one that's dictated nationally. That, you know, in terms of growth fund and growth fund payments are essentially not for popular growth per se, but they're aware that they're sort of backed by data in terms of demand from within the partnership area and catchment. But yeah, take the point entirely on.
Thanks, Bruce.
Okay. In that case, can we again take the recommendations for sort of item 6 of the report? Again, can I ask Schools Forum to note the information provided in respect to the various elements of the DSG grant and the additional information that will be provided to the 15th of February meeting in 4 short weeks' time? Any issues, questions or objections in relation to that? Okay. Recommendation 2.2, approve the use of the £187,600 worth of the growth funding as outlined for the King Edward VI Academy with effect from September 2025, covering those 7 months through to the March 26. Again, all in support of that. Any objections? Okay. And specifically for our maintained school members, so I'm looking at James, I'm looking at Mike, Nicola is unfortunately, I believe, not with us. In respect of the individual delegation decisions, can I take an opinion, please, in relation to the delegation decision in relation to the school reorganisation contingency? In favour? Okay, thank you. James, yeah. Sorry, I'm desperately trying to find that bit of the report again. There we are. The term free school meals determination eligibility, the free school meals checking service. Again, agreed. Trade union facility time. Thank you. And last but not least, the English as additional language service for maintained schools. James, right, appreciate that. And again, I think when we bring back membership, we'll be keen to reinforce and republicise the current vacancies for Schools Forum members, both across maintained schools and academies. But thank you for your support and carrying those recommendations. If we then move to the next item, essentially that's item number 7, work programme and meeting dates attached. I apologise that there is an error in that in terms of the High Needs Committee. It's been marked as Wednesday, the 3rd of February. The 3rd of February was a Monday, but I would propose that we will hold a High Needs Committee open to all Schools Forum members on Wednesday, the 5th, at that time between 9:30 and 11. Again, with the main substantive item being a more detailed review of the Public Accounts Committee paper. And the next Schools Forum meeting is on Wednesday, the 19th of February. Okay.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, Chair.
I haven't received any other business items, so I think that concludes our meeting today. And thank you to everyone for your involvement and participation. And we'll see you on the well, hopefully we'll see most of you at the High Needs Committee meeting in a fortnight. If not, it will be at the next Schools Forum on the 19th of February. Thank you very much, everyone.